What can one man do in 13 years? Most kings spend a lifetime trying to protect the kingdom they inherited. Alexander did something different. He inherited a kingdom at the edge of the Greek world. Then he crossed into Asia. He defeated the greatest empire of his age. He took Egypt. He marched through Syria, Mesopotamia, Persia, Central Asia, and all the way toward India. And before he turned 33, he was dead. His empire did not last. His family did not hold it together. His generals divided it among themselves. But the world he created did not disappear. Greek language, Greek art, Greek cities, Greek ideas, and Greek military power spread across lands that had once belonged to Egypt, Babylon, Persia, and many older civilizations. This is the story of Alexander the Great, a king who ruled for only 13 years, a conqueror who moved faster than almost anyone in ancient history, a man whose empire vanished quickly, but whose influence shaped the world for centuries. This is the story of the Alexander Empire and the beginning of the Hellenistic Age. In 336 BC, King Philip II of Macedon was assassinated. His son Alexander became king. He was only 20 years old. To many people, this looked like a moment of weakness. Macedon had only recently become the strongest power in Greece. Greek city-states such as Athens and Thebes still remembered their independence. Some of them believed that Philip's death was their chance to break free. They looked at Alexander and saw a young man, but they did not yet understand what kind of young man he was. Alexander had grown up inside a royal court built for war. His father Philip had transformed Macedon from a regional kingdom into a military machine. The Macedonian army had long spears, disciplined infantry, powerful cavalry, and commanders who had been trained through years of campaigning. Alexander inherited all of this, but he also inherited something even more dangerous, a dream. Philip had planned to lead the Greeks east against the Persian Empire. That plan now belonged to Alexander. Before he could attack Persia, he had to prove that he could control Greece. So he moved quickly. He crushed rebellion. He forced the Greek states to recognize his leadership. He showed them that Macedon had not become weaker after Philip. It had become more unpredictable, because now it was ruled by a young king who did not want to simply defend his father's kingdom. He wanted to go beyond it. To the east stood the Persian Empire. This was not a small enemy. This was one of the greatest imperial systems the ancient world had ever seen. The Persian Empire stretched across huge territories. It ruled over many peoples, many languages, many cities, and many ancient lands. It controlled parts of Asia Minor, Syria, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Iran, and Central Asia. It had royal roads, provincial governors, great palaces, vast wealth, and centuries of imperial tradition. Compared with Persia, Macedon looked small. But size is not always the same as strength. The Persian Empire was enormous. Alexander's army was smaller, but it was fast, disciplined, and led by a commander who was willing to take risks at the exact moment when risk mattered most. In 334 BC, Alexander crossed into Asia. This was the real beginning of his legend. He was not simply raiding. He was not simply looking for tribute. He was challenging the greatest empire of the age. From the beginning, Alexander understood something important. If he wanted to defeat Persia, he could not only win battles. He had to take control of the roads, the ports, the cities, and the symbols of power. He had to make people believe that the old empire was falling and that a new ruler had arrived. Alexander's first major victories came in Asia Minor. At the Granicus River, he defeated Persian forces and opened the way deeper into Western Asia. But Alexander did not rush blindly into the center of Persia. He moved along the coast. This was strategy. The Persian fleet was still dangerous. If Persia controlled the sea, it could threaten Greece and Macedon behind him. So Alexander took city after city along the eastern Mediterranean. He wanted to remove Persia's naval bases. He wanted to cut the empire away from the sea. Then came one of the most important moments of the campaign. In 333 BC, Alexander met King Darius III of Persia near Issus. This was not just another battle. This was the Macedonian king facing the Persian king. Darius represented the old imperial world. Alexander represented a new military force rising from the west. The battlefield was chaotic. The stakes were enormous, and Alexander did what he often did best. He looked for the center of fear. He did not only attack the Persian army, he attacked the confidence of the Persian king. When Darius fled, the Persian army broke. The message was devastating. The great king of Persia had faced Alexander and had not been able to stop him. After Issus, Alexander was no longer just a brilliant young commander. He was a threat to the entire order of the ancient Near East. After Issus, Alexander continued south. He took the Phoenician coast. Some cities surrendered, others resisted. The island city of Tyre became one of the most famous sieges of his career. Tyre was proud, wealthy, and difficult to conquer, but Alexander was relentless. He could not allow a powerful coastal city to remain behind him. After Tyre and Gaza, the road to Egypt opened. Egypt had been under Persian rule. Egypt had been under Persian rule. To many Egyptians, Alexander did not appear only as an invader, he appeared as the enemy of Persia. That made his arrival different. In Egypt, Alexander was welcomed in many places. He respected local religious traditions. He visited important sacred sites. And near the western edge of the Nile Delta, he founded a city, Alexandria. At that moment, it was just a new foundation on the coast of Egypt. But later, Alexandria would become one of the most important cities in the ancient world. It would become a center of trade, scholarship, science, literature, and culture. Ships would come from across the Mediterranean. Scholars would gather there. Greek and Egyptian traditions would meet there. Alexander did not live to see Alexandria at its greatest, but his name would live in its streets, its harbor, and its place in history. After Egypt, Alexander turned back toward the heart of the Persian Empire. Darius III prepared for one more great battle. This time, he chose open ground near Gaugamela. The year was 331 BC. Darius wanted space. He wanted room for his cavalry. He wanted to use the size of his army. He wanted to overwhelm Alexander. On paper, Persia still looked powerful. It still had men, horses, wealth, and land. But at Gaugamela, Alexander showed again why he was so dangerous. He did not panic in front of numbers. He studied the battlefield. He moved carefully. He waited for the right opening. Then, when the Persian line stretched and a gap appeared, Alexander led his cavalry straight toward the center. Once again, he aimed at Darius. In ancient warfare, the king was more than a commander. He was the symbol of the army's courage. If the king fled, the army's spirit could collapse. And that is what happened. Darius fled again. The Persian army broke again. After Gaugamela, the fate of the Persian Empire was decided. Alexander entered Babylon, then Susa, then Persepolis. These were not ordinary cities. They were centers of imperial wealth and royal power. Persepolis especially carried deep symbolic meaning. It represented the glory of the Persian kings. When Alexander entered it, the world could see that the old empire had fallen. The Macedonian king had done what almost no one in the Greek world had imagined possible. He had defeated Persia. For many rulers, conquering Persia would have been enough. It would have been the achievement of a lifetime. Alexander could have stopped. He could have ruled from Babylon. He could have enjoyed the wealth and prestige of the empire he had taken. But Alexander did not stop. He kept moving east. He crossed the Iranian plateau. He marched into Central Asia. He campaigned in Bactria and Sogdiana. This part of the story was different. It was not one great battle followed by a great victory. It was hard, exhausting, and complicated. The land was difficult. Local resistance was fierce. The war became slower and more frustrating. Alexander discovered that conquering the center of an empire was not the same as controlling its edges. Still, he pushed forward. He also began to change. He adopted some Persian royal customs. He brought Persian nobles into his administration. He encouraged marriages between his Macedonian officers and women from the lands he had conquered. He wanted to build something larger than a Macedonian kingdom. He wanted an empire where Greek and Persian elites could serve together. But this created tension. Many Macedonians had followed him because they believed they were fighting Persia. Now they saw their king honoring Persian customs. They saw him becoming not only king of Macedon, but ruler of Asia. To Alexander, this may have looked like the future. To some of his men, it looked like betrayal. In 326 BC, Alexander reached the Indian subcontinent. There, he faced King Porus at the Hydaspes River. This was one of the hardest battles of his career. Porus brought war elephants. For Macedonian soldiers, elephants were terrifying and unfamiliar. The battle was brutal and difficult. Alexander won. But victory came at a cost. His army had been marching and fighting for years. They had crossed mountains, deserts, rivers, and foreign lands. They had followed him farther than any Macedonian army had ever gone. And now Alexander wanted to go even farther. He wanted to push deeper into India. But his soldiers refused. This was one of the most important moments in his life. Alexander could defeat Persian kings. He could take ancient cities. He could lead cavalry charges into the heart of enemy armies. But he could not defeat the exhaustion of his own men. They wanted to go home. They had reached the edge of what they could endure. So Alexander turned back. It was not because he had met a stronger king, It was because even the greatest conqueror had reached the human limit of conquest. Alexander returned west, but his empire was not yet stable. It was enormous. It stretched from Greece to Egypt, from Asia Minor to Mesopotamia, from Persia to Central Asia and toward India. But it had grown too quickly. It depended too much on Alexander himself. A lasting empire needs more than victory. It needs law. It needs administration. It needs a clear system of succession. It needs local leaders who accept the new order. It needs time. Alexander had victories. He had ambition. He had cities. He had plans. But he did not have time. In 323 BC, Alexander died in Babylon. He was only 32 years old. His son had not yet been born. His half-brother had limited political power. His generals were ambitious, experienced, and surrounded by armies. The empire had no clear center without Alexander. Soon, his commanders fought for control. The great unified empire broke apart. Ptolemy took Egypt. Seleucus took much of Asia. Other generals fought over Macedon, Greece, and nearby regions. The empire of Alexander was gone, but the age of Alexander was not. After Alexander's death, the political map changed, but the cultural world he created continued. This is what historians call the Hellenistic Age. It began after Alexander's death and lasted until Rome absorbed the last major Hellenistic kingdom, Egypt, in 30 BC. This period was not simply Greek culture replacing older cultures. It was a world of mixture. Greek language spread across courts, armies, cities, and trade networks. Greek-style cities appeared across the eastern Mediterranean and western Asia. Greek art changed as it encountered Egyptian, Persian, Mesopotamian, and Central Asian traditions. Philosophers, merchants, soldiers, priests, and scholars moved through a world that was more connected than before. Alexandria in Egypt became one of the great centers of this new age. Antioch in Syria became another. Seleucia, Pergamon, and many other cities became part of a wider Hellenistic network. In this world, a person could live in Egypt, speak Greek, worship local gods, trade with merchants from the Mediterranean, and read ideas that had traveled from far away. This was Alexander's deeper legacy. His empire collapsed, but his conquests connected regions that had once belonged to separate worlds. He did not create peace everywhere. He did not build a perfect empire. He was often ruthless. His campaigns brought destruction as well as change. But historically, his conquests opened a new chapter. They spread Greek culture across a vast area and created the conditions for a new international age. So why does Alexander belong in a series about history's most powerful civilizations? Not because his empire lasted the longest, it did not. Not because he created the most stable state, he did not. Not because his family ruled for centuries, they did not. Alexander belongs here because for a brief moment, his empire became the most unstoppable military force in the known world. He defeated the Persian Empire. He took Egypt. He marched through the lands of ancient kingdoms. He reached the edge of India. He created one of the largest empires the ancient world had ever seen. And even after that empire broke apart, the cultural world that followed lasted for centuries. The Hellenistic Age changed art, cities, language, trade, science, politics, and the relationship between East and West. Alexander's life was short. His empire was fragile, but his impact was enormous. He was not just a king who conquered land. He was a turning point between two worlds. Before him, Greek civilization was powerful, but mostly centered around the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean. After him, Greek culture became part of Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia, Persia, and Central Asia. That is why Alexander's empire matters. It was a short empire with a long shadow. Alexander died in Babylon at the age of 32. By then, he'd gone farther than almost any ruler before him. Alexander died in Babylon at the age of 32. By then, he had gone farther than almost any ruler before him. But death came before he could finish the world he was trying to build. His generals divided his empire, his family line collapsed, his political dream failed. And yet, history did not forget him. Because sometimes an empire does not need to last for centuries to change the world. Sometimes it only needs to open doors that can never be closed again. Alexander opened those doors. Greek culture moved east. Eastern traditions moved west. New kingdoms rose. New cities flourished. New ideas traveled across old borders. The empire disappeared, but the Hellenistic world remained. That is the paradox of Alexander the Great. He built an empire too fast to survive, but he changed the world too deeply to be forgotten. 13 years of conquest, a lifetime of ambition, centuries of influence. This was the Alexander Empire. This was the beginning of the Hellenistic Age, and this was one of history's most powerful civilizations at its most explosive moment.